What's up, everybody? Welcome to System Crafters. I'm David Wilson, and today is finally the day that we're going to learn how to install GNU Guix as your main Linux distribution. So my goal here in this video is to make the installation process as smooth as possible for first-time Guix installers, or people who are installing Guix for the first time as a Linux distribution. Particularly whenever you're installing on a machine that isn't supported by the Linux Libre kernel that comes on the default or the official Guix installer image that you get from the Guix website. If you don't already know, the Linux Libre image or kernel doesn't include a lot of the drivers and firmwares that you need for modern computers like laptops and desktops that have devices that are considered proprietary, who have proprietary blobs that are not included with the Linux Libre kernel. So today we're going to take an installation process that actually uses the full Linux kernel so that you can use your Wi-Fi card or any other devices that are necessary for the installation process, and also to make sure that you have those available whenever you use the machine after you fully installed Guix. So by the end of this video, we'll have Guix installed with the GNOME desktop environment. I have XFCE written here, but it's actually going to be GNOME. And with working Wi-Fi on this machine that I'm installing on. And we'll also show you how to update the system so that you can keep things up to date after you finally get it installed. So I also want to just make a quick note. If you're watching this video like maybe a month or more after I've released it, definitely check the show notes. The link's going to be down in the description below to make sure I haven't added any additional notes or pointers about how to do the installation, because things may change over time. GNU Guix is constantly under development, and things that we see here today in this video may actually be different later. So if you see anything that's different, definitely come back and check the show notes just in case we've left any additional notes or changes to the process that we follow today. All right, so I'm going to make a few assumptions in this video about you and about the circumstances under which you want to install GNU Guix. First of all, you probably haven't installed GNU Guix before, because if you had, you probably wouldn't actually need to watch this video. But you probably have installed Linux before. And the reason why I say that is that GNU Guix is it can be a little bit harder to set up compared to other more mainline Linux distributions like Ubuntu or Manjaro or other distributions that are made to be more user-friendly out of the box. So if you've never installed Linux before, I recommend trying to install one of these other more mainstream distributions first, just to get a feel for the installation process, specifically around partitioning disks and making sure that you have the necessary disk space available to install a Linux distribution, because that's probably the trickiest part of all of this. Also, I'm making the assumption that you don't have a pre-existing Guix system configuration. So if you've never installed Guix before, it's very likely you don't have a Guix system config set up already, which is fine because the installer actually generates one for you. So you don't have to know how to set one of those up. Now you may have come across another Guix configuration of someone else's on the internet, or maybe an example that you could take and use. You can still try to use that configuration as part of this installation process, but the process that we're going to follow in this video is specifically around installing using the generated configuration that comes from the graphical installer. And also, the last assumption is that you're probably going to be installing Guix on a machine that requires non-free firmware and drivers, like I mentioned before, most likely a laptop that only has Wi-Fi for internet access. So if you have a computer that has Ethernet, you don't necessarily need to use this custom installer that I'm going to tell you about today. You could probably just use the off-the-shelf GNU Guix installation image, but it's probably better just to follow the instructions that I'm giving here just for best results, because you don't want to have to start over again if you run into any trouble. So I want to make sure that I point out again that what we're going to be seeing today is a customized version of the official Guix installer, something that I put together to make this whole process easier for you. So the instructions that are on the GNU Guix manual may not apply to some of the things we're doing today, but I'll let you know when we do something that's a little bit different than what the actual installer expects you to do. Okay, so first of all, you need to actually download the installer so that you can burn it to a DVD or a USB stick to use for installation. So I've got this link here that's going to take you to the Guix installer repo that I've set up, and there's a releases list there that will give you all of the previous builds of this installer and the ISO images that you can download there. So If I go to this link, you can see that there's a release here. It tells you what the channel configuration was for this build of the installer image. And there's going to be a link here to the Guix installer with a sort of a date number .iso. So if you download this ISO file, you can use this for the steps that come after what I'm going to tell you now. So I'm using a specific release of this installer today. It's probably the one you're looking at right now, but I recommend using the latest installer that's on this release list, just in case there's been any improvements to it over time. However, keep in mind that if you use a newer version, it may be a little bit different. The installation process may be a little bit different than what I just explained here. So if you run into any trouble, you can go try to use this release that I'm linking to for this specific video and use that instead. So once you download the ISO, you're gonna have to burn it onto a USB stick or a DVD. Probably you're gonna be using a USB stick because who has CD drives anymore? But you can follow the instructions from the GNU Guix manual for how to burn the ISO once you've downloaded it. I've got a link here to that page of the manual. However, probably since you're using a USB stick, if you're already on Linux, you can use the dd command to do that. So I'm giving you two commands here you can run on Linux. The first one is sudo dd. Make sure that you update the file path to the ISO to have that correct date number in it. And also make sure that you pick the right device to send this ISO to. This is extremely important because if you send it to the wrong device, you could overwrite your hard drive, and you really don't want to do that. So make sure that when you plug in your USB stick, you figure out which the right device is for your USB stick. It's probably going to be under one of these SD, like /dev/SD. It could be A, it could be B, it could be C. It depends on how many hard drives you have and what types of drives you have. So the best way to do that typically is just to go look at the drive list in your shell. You could go to your shell and ls/dev/sd star and then see what shows up there. I don't have the drive plugged in right now, so you can't see anything. But if you have any questions about that particular aspect, you can ask us in the System Crafters Discord or in the IRC chat. Check the links in the description, and we can try to help you with that if you have trouble with it. Okay, so once you run this command, it's going to write that ISO to the USB stick. And after that command finishes, you're going to want to run this sync command. It's important to do this because it will make sure that all of the data gets written to that device before you unplug it. Because if you unplug it too soon, then the image will not be correct and you probably won't be able to boot from it. So just make sure to run that sync command last. So if you're on Windows, there's a program called Rufus that you can use for putting the image on a USB stick. So go check out that link below if you're using Windows and you want an easy way to put that image on your USB stick. The image is about 1.5 GB, so make sure that you have a stick that can hold that much at least. All right, the next very important thing is to prepare your hard drive. This is kind of important because you need to be careful with your existing data. So there's two ways you can go about this. One is you can just wipe your entire hard drive and let the Guix installer create a completely new partition table for you and install using that. But many of you probably are going to be installing on a machine where you have an existing OS, like maybe Windows or another Linux distribution that you want to keep while you try Guix. So you need to try to back up your data first so that in case you do something wrong or the Guix installer does something wrong, you don't lose all your data. And then you're going to have to make room for your new Guix partition. And typically that takes resizing a partition. So maybe you already have a partition that takes up most of your hard drive. You may have to resize that partition to make space for a new one for Guix to be installed. But like I said, if you're intended to just wipe your whole drive, then you don't have to worry about that at all. So for resizing, if you're on Linux, probably you know how to do that already. I'm not going to go through the instructions for that. But if you're on Windows, there is a program called Disk Manager that comes with Windows. And if you right-click on your main partition with Disk Manager and click the Shrink Volume action, it will give you the ability to make your volume smaller. How much smaller you can make it, it really depends on how fragmented your file system is or how much files you have on there, really. But generally, you should be able to get enough space. At a minimum for Guix, you're going to want about 50 gigabytes because the GNU Guix store on the drive can get pretty big and it will fill up your space pretty fast. So definitely have about 50 gigs, maybe 20 at the very minimum, but that's pushing it a little bit, I think. All right, so booting the installer. Let's finally boot the installation media. I've got another computer that I'm going to pull up right now to do that with. So whenever you plug in your USB stick and reboot your machine, you're probably going to have to press a button like maybe F12 to pull up the boot menu to select the device that you want to boot from. So let me go ahead and just jump over to that screen really quickly so we can take a look at what that looks like on my machine. So we have this boot menu. I'm going to go down and select my USB hard drive, the Kingston Data Traveler 3.0, and press enter on that. So now we can see we get the grub menu for the installer. I'll press, well, I guess it goes on its own, but it's starting the process of installation now, or sorry, starting to boot the installer from the USB stick. And you're going to see a lot of raw messages written to the screen here. You're also going to see this once you finally set up Guix on your system, but don't be alarmed at all of these messages. Usually there's nothing wrong happening there, so don't let it distract you too much. And now what we'll see is that the installer, the graphical installer, will start up at some point. We're going to have this nice blue and red screen that shows up here. And this is basically going to be a wizard-like installation experience where you can, where it's going to ask you a lot of questions to help you set up your system, and then it will create a configuration for you based on those questions. So we're going to start off by selecting the language to use for the installer. I'm going to select English here. And then it asks to choose a territory for this language. Since I'm in the US, I'm going to go down and select United States, but maybe you want to select the appropriate territory for you wherever you are located. And then we get to the main choice for how to proceed with installation of GNU Guix. There's two main options here. There's either use the graphical installer, which really isn't graphical, but it's more like menus like this. And there's also install using the shell-based process. If you have an existing Guix configuration and you're experienced installing Guix, you probably will pick the shell process. But since we are going for first-time installers today, we're going to pick the graphical install and press enter. Now it wants us to pick a time zone. We're going to go through and pick America, since that's where I'm at. And then I'll go down and pick, let's see, Los Angeles, because that's the time zone that I'm in, even though I'm not in LA. Make sure that you pick the right place for yourself so that your time zone gets set correctly on your machine. Also, it's going to ask you about the keyboard layout that you want to use. There's many layouts here, and once you select a language, it's going to ask you more things about what layout you want to use. So definitely make sure to go through all these and see which one you might want to use that's ideal for you. I'm going to select English US here. And in the next screen, it's going to ask me for a variant layout. So maybe I want something like, let's say, Dvorak or Colmac or Workman. If you use any of these layouts, you can pick those right now. I'm just going to pick the default English US layout here. Now, it's going to ask me for the system host name. So now we're getting to the point where we're starting to give the details for our actual system. And I recommend pick something fun here, because this is a system for your own purposes. So I'm just going to type in Crafter, because I'm not being very original. And now we're going to be asked about setting up internet access, because you're going to want to install binary packages for a lot of the things that you're going to set up on your Guix system. So it needs to connect to the internet. If you have an Ethernet card in your machine and you have the ability to plug into an Ethernet jack to get internet, you can use the wired selection here. But since I'm on a laptop that only has Wi-Fi, I'm going to click Wi-Fi here. Now, since we're using the full Linux kernel image from the Nonguix channel, we do have the Wi-Fi drivers necessary to turn this on, which is great because we want to use Wi-Fi. However, sometimes the installer will not work 100% correct whenever trying to activate your device or find networks. And as you can see here, it tells me that no Wi-Fi is detected, which is wrong because it can actually use it. It's just a matter of moving the arrow key to the right here to the scan button and then pressing enter. Then it will look for Wi-Fi networks again, and now it will actually find some. I'm going to select this first one here. It's going to ask me for the password. So I'll type that in, and then I'll go down to OK by using the tab key. So in this UI, you can use usually arrow keys or the tab key to cycle through UI elements. I'm going to press OK here, and now it's going to try to connect to the internet, and we'll see if it actually does accomplish that. Okay, so it did connect, which is great. Sometimes it may not connect the first time. You might have to connect to your Wi-Fi endpoint a couple of times before this works. Eventually, it will actually connect. So if you have trouble with that, just keep trying. Now it's going to ask us about substitute server discovery. It says by turning this option on, you allow Guix to fetch substitutes or pre-built binaries during installation from servers discovered on your local area network, in addition to the official server. So I say definitely click enable on this just so that you can get all the substitutes for the packages you want to install. The reason why is because otherwise it's going to try to compile the source for every package you install, and you really don't want to do that because it's going to take forever. So let's click enable here so that we pull our pre-built packages. Now it asks you to select a root password for the system administrator. What you type here does not matter because we're actually going to take a different approach to finishing the installation process. So what you put here just doesn't even get used. So you can put whatever you want here, but it will ask you to confirm the value. So just make sure that you type the same thing twice. So now it asks us to create a user, and you'll definitely want to do this because you can't use the root account all day long. You need to create an actual normal user for yourself so that you can use your machine as a normal user. You can also add multiple users here if you want, but we're just going to create one user right now. So at the moment, the add button you see on the right-hand side is already selected, so I can just press enter to select that. It's going to ask for the username first. I'm going to type in David Will, my username. And then it will, if you press tab, it will take you to the real name box. I'll just put David Wilson. And I'll go tab again a couple times to the password box. I'm actually going to leave this blank because once again, it's not going to create, we're not going to use the password here that gets created. We're going to set it later after we get the system set up. So I'll just use tab to go down to the OK button. It will ask you to confirm the password, but since we had a blank password, we can just continue to the OK button again, leave it blank. And now we've got that user created. So I'll press OK to proceed through this dialog. And now is the fun part where we get to decide which desktop environment we want to install on our new machine. So we've got quite a few options here, a lot of things you probably recognize, other things you might not recognize very well. I do highly recommend that you install a mainstream desktop environment along with anything else you might want to install, like let's say EXWM or i3, because the more minimal desktop environments or window managers probably don't have all the stuff set up for you to easily set up your Wi-Fi after you install your system. So what we're going to do here is we're going to select GNOME, and we'll also select EXWM because I use it all the time. And that's going to install both of these. So you'll have the option to boot from either of these whenever you finally get into your system that you've set up. So I'm going to select OK here now that I've selected those. Also, I think you don't have to select one if you don't want a desktop environment, but I kind of recommend that you do that unless you're installing this on a server. Now you get to select the services that you want to enable by default. We have the option of, it's going to set up the Mozilla NSS certificates by default, which you really do want because you need to have SSL certificates to verify the HTTPS hosts or whomever you try to connect to. So definitely leave that on. However, there's the OpenSSH Secure Shell daemon that you can turn on if you want SSH access to this machine, which could be useful for various things. I won't turn it on right now. There's also the Tor Anonymous Network Router in case you want to use the Onion Router network for anonymous internet use. You can turn that on here as well. But I won't select either of these. I'll just let the default be selected here, and I'll select OK. And now is another really important part of the installer is selecting a partitioning method. So like I mentioned before, there's two ways you could go about this. One is to let Guix just wipe your entire drive and create all your partitions from scratch. Definitely only select this guided option if that's what you want. Otherwise, do not select that. If you want to keep existing partitions you have, you're going to want to go to the manual option. So I've got instructions in the show notes about how you can use the guided partitioning method if you want to go that route. But today I'm going to show you the manual option because I'm guessing that most people are going to have an existing system they don't want to delete. They just want to create a new partition to install Guix on. So we're going to pick manual here. And now it's going to show you the partitions that are currently available on all of the devices that you have connected, except for the USB device. This was actually a bug that just got fixed recently by Matthew from the Guix maintainer team. So thank you, Matthew, for fixing this issue that I was having whenever I was preparing this video. Right now, all we see is the one hard drive that I have in this machine. It's my SSD hard drive. And we have a few partitions already here. I have the FE system partition, which is necessary if you have a newer laptop and you have to use the UEFI boot system, I guess you call it. Then I have a, let's see, there's a Microsoft Reserve partition for some reason. There's a NTFS partition that I have Windows installed on. There's another smaller Linux partition here. And then I also have an ext4 partition that I've been reinstalling Guix on this machine like 100 times over the last few days. So we're going to get rid of this partition in just a second. But we also have one last NTFS partition for like some kind of recovery data. So in this case, I don't have any space available for a new partition, but I can easily make space. However, if you went on ahead and made space like I recommended before, one of these entries here will probably say free space over in that third column. And if you want to create a partition, you can press enter on that free space entry. In fact, what I'm going to do now, I'm going to delete this partition number 6 here, this 509 gigabyte partition. I'm going to press the delete key on that to delete it. Only do that if you want to delete something. Don't do it otherwise. It's going to ask me if I want to delete partition 6. I'm going to say OK. And now we're going to see that free space like I mentioned before. So now I can just press enter on this free space entry. And it's going to give me another dialog that asks me what type of partition that I want to create. So I'm going to leave this as the default of ext4 because that's sort of the default partition type that you would use on Linux systems, and it's fine for what we're going to do. We'll leave the size to where it is. Probably if you're filling free space, it's just going to pick the remaining space available, which is totally fine. It will also ask you if you want to encrypt the partition or not. Typically, I encrypt my partitions because it's just better to not have your data sitting there open for anybody to read if they happen to take your hard drive out of your machine. So if you press enter here, it will ask you for a label. I'll just type in Guix here and press OK. And then it will ask for a mount point. This is another very important part of this process. You need to set the mount point to /, which is basically the root directory. Otherwise, Guix won't be able to install on this partition because it needs to know which one is going to have the root of the file system for your new system. So we're going to put one / character in here and just select OK and press enter. Now we have everything here that we need to create this partition. So I'll press tab to go down to the OK button here and press enter there. And now we're back to our listing, and we can see that on this entry number 6, now it says that the mount point is the / character, and also the label is Guix. So once we're happy with the partitioning setup we have here, we can go to the OK button and press enter. Now, some people will tell you that it's good to have a swap partition set up, and you might want to do that if you have a machine that has low RAM, like maybe if you have 4 gigabytes of RAM or maybe even 8 gigabytes of RAM. You could use some of that free space to create a swap partition if you wanted to. Go look up look up information about swap partitions online to see if you really want to do that, and then you should be able to use this installer to create one. In fact, let me just delete this and see. I haven't actually prepared this, so we're going to see how this works. I'm going to go to this free space entry, press enter. If you click the file system type, you can go down to Linux swap to create a swap partition if you ever want to do that. So I'm going to go back and just recreate this XFS partition, and then I will put the label of Guix again, and then mount point of / one more time, and then go to OK to go back there. One last thing. If you select an existing partition, like let's say that you have an existing Linux distro you just want to wipe and start over with Guix. If you select your existing partition, it will give you this option to format the partition. Typically, you want to set that to yes. It might be no by default. So if you want to make sure the partition is wiped, if it exists already, select yes for that format the partition entry, and then you'll be able to format that. Okay, so I think we're done now. We want to continue with this partitioning scheme. So what I'm going to do is press tab to go to OK and then press enter. And now, since I chose to encrypt the drive, it's going to ask me for a passphrase. If you did not choose to encrypt the drive, you won't be asked this. So I'm just going to type in a passphrase for this purpose. Then I'll press OK. And it will ask me to confirm the passphrase. I'll press OK again. Now it will ask me to confirm that I want to modify the partition table and format that partition. And since I do want to do that, I'm going to just choose continue and press enter. So now it will go and format that partition, and then once it's complete, it's going to give me the final generated configuration for my new system, which we can see here. And this is the point at which we are going to stop using the graphical installer and then go for a modified approach to finish installation. And the reason why we do that is because the installer by default is going to try to install the Linux Libre kernel on your machine. But if you need to have the full Linux kernel, then you're going to have to do some tweaks to this file and then install the rest of it manually just to make sure that you get the right drivers on the machine when you finish the installation. So what we're going to do here is we're going to switch to another TTY, or another virtual terminal on our device. And the way that you do that, let me actually switch back to my notes really quick so we can take a look at the keys for that. All the things I just told you before are all written down in the show notes as well. So if you want to refer to anything in the show notes, just go and check out the link in the description below. So you can press the Control-Alt-F3 key binding to switch to another terminal inside of the installation ISO. Sorry for that. And what that's going to do is put you into another screen where you can press enter to go get dropped into a shell. I apologize that the font is very small on the screen. I couldn't actually control that whenever I can control the font size, but for some reason, whenever I connect my computer to this video capture device, this font size goes back small again. So if you have trouble reading this part, don't worry, it's not gonna be very long. And also you should probably watch it on a desktop PC if you have trouble seeing it. Okay, so now we are in the shell, we are the root user, and what we need to do now is set up the Guix build daemon to point to the new root location where we're going to install our system. So what we're going to do is type in the herd command, and we're going to start. Herd is the shepherd service manager that is used in GNU Guix. So herd command is almost like system control if you use systemd. So we can use the start subcommand to start a service. So we're going to start the cal store, and I have no idea why it's called cal store. Don't ask me. And we're going to point it at the /mount folder because we've mounted our new file system at /mount, MNT. I'm going to press enter there, and it's going to tell me that the cal store has been started. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to copy over the channels file we used for this installation image and also the configuration file. Well, the config file is already there. So first, I'm just going to copy the channels file. This is something that does not exist in the main Guix installer. This is something that I added to the customized installer that we're using for this video. So just keep that in mind. This is something special that you have to do for my specific image. I'm going to copy /etc/channels.scm over to /mount because this is the new partition for our real system that we're installing. I'm going to copy that into the /etc folder. I'm also going to change the permissions on it to make it writable because by default, this is part of the installation image and that file is not writable by default. So I'm just going to go and make that file in the mount etc/channels scm file. I'm going to make that file writable with the chmod +w command, basically. Okay, now we've got the channels file set up. We've got our configuration file placed in the folder, but we need to edit it. Like I mentioned before, we need to change this file to make it so we can set up the full Linux kernel. So I'm going to use Emacs to do that. We've got Emacs on this image already. So I can type in Emacs /mnt/etc/config.scm, and that's going to pull up Emacs for this configuration file. Don't worry too much about the contents of this file. We're going to explain this in more detail in another video, but for now, I'll tell you exactly the changes to be made to set this up correctly. First of all, we're going to use our fancy Emacs key bindings to navigate over to this first line that says use modules. What we need to do is to add another module to be pulled in. I'm going to use the non-GNU packages Linux module and make sure that you add another closing parentheses there. Then we're going to jump down to this line right after operating system, and we're going to say kernel Linux and make sure to wrap that in parentheses. Another open parentheses here, firmware, another open parentheses, list. Oops, sometimes my my touchpad causes the cursor to move, so I have to go back up to where I was before. All right, so firmware, list, Linux-firmware, and then close that with 2 closing parentheses, and then that's all the edits we need to make. So you don't need to touch anything else here. Everything else has been generated based on what you've done so far in this graphical installer. So we're going to use Control-X, Control-S, and then Control-X, Control-C to save and exit Emacs now. And you can see that we have the very, very bottom line of the screen right now is back to the shell. I just type in clear so we can clear the screen. Okay, apparently that doesn't come with Guix. So now we've edited the configuration to use the full Linux kernel and the Linux firmware. So now we can finally proceed with the actual installation process. So what we're going to do to proceed with that is we are going to run a command that's kind of long, but I'll explain what it does once we've typed it out. So we're going to type in Guix time-machine -C. We're going to give it the path to that channels file in mount/etc/channels. We're going to type 2 hyphens, and then we're going to type system init /mount/etc/config, and then one last /mnt mount. So what this does, it runs the Guix time machine command. The reason we use that is so that we can tell it to use our specific channels file for the installation, because otherwise we're going to have to set up a channel file, we're going to have to run Guix pull and do a lot of stuff like that that is kind of like extra steps. using this approach allows you to just have one command that starts the installation with all the right channels and all the right stuff, and then it will finish just in that single command. So that's really the way that we want to do this. The second part that you see with the 2 hyphens, that's sort of like saying, we're going to call Guix time machine, and then we want to run this Guix command system init. So this would normally be Guix system init, but in this case, it's just system init because we're passing it along through time machine to run the initialization of the system with our config.scm file that was generated and then edited by us. And then we're going to target that /mount folder as the location to install the system into. So now, if I press enter, it's going to start the installation process. First, it's going to pull those channels inside of that channel file. We're going to see it try to pull the Guix repository, then it will pull the non-Guix repository, and then it will start installing everything for the system that we've configured with the config.scm file. Now, this part is going to take about 30 minutes to run, probably depending on the power of your machine and also depending on the speed of your internet. So go make a coffee or a tea or a glass of water, come back and just wait a little bit for it to complete. And then once this finally completes, I'll come back. I'm going to cut the video now and then jump right ahead to the point where this is completed, just so that we don't have to spend a lot of time watching Guix install for me. If anything comes up during my installation that's a problem, I might cut in a little bit just to show you how to deal with that issue. But I kind of doubt it's going to be a problem because I've done this a few times already, so I kind of know what to expect. All right, so now we're going to cut ahead to the point at which this installation process completes. We'll be right back. Okay, while installing Guix on this machine, something that I've seen a couple times has happened once again, where the installation process will sort of hang after it's installed a certain package. And this is not a problem. If you happen to see that a particular package has been sitting at the screen for a while and hasn't proceeded, or it just seems like it's installed it, but nothing else is happening, just hit Control-C to go back to the shell. This doesn't break your installation at all. In fact, if you just press up to get to the command we just typed in the history and press enter, it will start where it left off in the installation process. So you'll see now that it should start just installing more packages and doing some other things that it needs to do to get the installation process going. That's one of the nice things about Guix, is that the installation of anything is transactional, and the effects of the install don't get applied until everything has finally been downloaded and put together for that. So you can see now that it's updating substitutes, and it's going to proceed in installing more packages. I think probably what happened is that for a moment it lost internet access, and then it didn't really know how to proceed. So sometimes you might just need to help it a little bit by using Control-C and then running the Guix time machine, etc. command one more time just to get it back going. I've seen this both with trying to install using the GNOME desktop environment and also the XFCE desktop environment. So it seems like it's probably just something with the Guix installation process. So just want to let you know that little bit of a tip. And now we'll cut ahead again to the point where the installation successfully completes. So see you in a second. Okay, it took a while, but the system is finally finished installing. Now, once the system installation is complete, it's going to drop us back to that root shell again. And the last thing we need to do is just type reboot and press enter to reboot the system. Now, whenever your system starts rebooting, definitely make sure to take the installation media out of your computer so that you don't end up booting it again if you happen to have that set up to boot automatically. So we're going to type in reboot and press enter. And now, once my system starts rebooting, I'll remove the USB stick, and then we will start booting back into our new system. Now, I'm sorry for this no signal screen, but that's what my video capture device does whenever the computer is rebooting, but we'll see the actual system in just a moment if I don't have to restart it again. Okay, maybe I'll go ahead and just turn it off, turn it back on, and then we will see the Lenovo logo. I forgot to mention earlier that I'm installing Guix on a Lenovo ThinkPad X1 Carbon 5th generation. So this is a laptop from probably around 2017, but I've also installed Guix on more recent Lenovo ThinkPad laptops like the X1 Nano, and I've had just the same amount of success with it. So just so you know that modern laptops, even very recent laptops, can work pretty well with Guix as well. Okay, so now it's going to ask me for the passphrase. You see up in the upper left-hand corner of the screen here, it wants me to type in the passphrase that I used whenever I created that partition, since we went with an encrypted partition. So I'm going to type in the passphrase and press enter. You won't see the keys show up whenever you type in the passphrase, so if you're typing, just go ahead and type the passphrase and press enter, and then it will take probably about 5 seconds before it starts the boot process after that. I'm not exactly sure why it takes so long, but just wait a moment and then it will get to the grub screen, and then it will tell you that we're going to boot into Linux 5.12.9, I think it said. Now you're going to have to enter the passphrase one last time, so I'm going to do that again, and then the boot process should start. If you did not set up encryption, you won't have these two prompts, but unfortunately you have to do the passphrase twice if you did choose encryption. So you'll see a lot of messages that get printed out here while booting, and eventually it's going to boot into the GDM display manager, which is basically the GNOME desktop environment's login screen. So that should show up here in just a moment. You may not see it on the screen though. I'm gonna have to log in a moment and then change the display settings so that it does show up on the recording. So right now, we're at the login screen. You can't see it. Before I can even log in, I need to do something very important. I need to switch to another TTY and set the password for the root account and for my user account. So what I'm gonna do now is hit Control-Alt-F5 to go to a virtual TTY. And you can see it allows us to log in here, saying the crafter login. I'm going to type in root here and press enter because I want to log in as the administrator. And as you notice, it lets us log in immediately because no password is set. So let's go ahead and set a password right now using the password command, PASSWD. I'll type in a password and then I will confirm that same password. Now I'm also going to use password to set the password for my Davy Will account. So password and then the account name you want to set the password for. Excuse me. I'll set the password and then I'll confirm it. And now we've set those two passwords, so we're done. I'll type exit so we get out of this shell. Now I'll go back over to the login screen for the graphical environment by hitting Control-Alt-F7. All of these key bindings will be on the show notes, so don't worry if you don't follow that right now. I'm gonna log in, and then it's gonna bring me to the GNOME desktop environment. And as soon as it sets that up, I'll change the display configuration so that you see the primary screen where you expect it to be. So I'll set that now to this display and then click apply. And now we should be set up to have that as the primary screen. I'll pull this over. Actually, we don't really need that anymore. So now we've got our full Guix system installed. And we're at a point where we can start installing applications and using them if we want to, which is great. One thing that we'll want to do is to set up our Wi-Fi connection. So since we installed the full Linux drivers using the full Linux kernel, we can click on Wi-Fi. We can select the network. I'll pick the same network that I used through the installation process. I'll put in the passphrase. And then once that connects, let's see. Oh, I have to use my admin password. I'm sorry for that. Okay, so you have to put in your user password first, and then you put in the passphrase for the network. And then that should connect in just a moment. So the reason why we're connecting is because I'm going to show you next how you can update your system once you finally get everything installed. So I'm going to run the terminal. And let me just turn on a dark mode here so we don't get blinded by this white screen. I'll set preferences. Theme variant dark. Okay, so now what we can do, there's something very important you should do before you move forward. What we need to do is take those channels.scm and config.scm files and save those into your user directory so that you can use them for future operations. Since we used a customized list of channels to get that Nonguix channel that has a full Linux kernel, we need to still use that anytime we try to update our system after this point. So what I'm going to do, if you remember, we had moved those into the mount/etc folder. So if you look at the /etc/channels.scm file, that file is there, as well as the config scm file for our system configuration. I'm going to create a new folder with makedir-p under my .config, and I'm going to call it Guix. And Guix knows to look for a channels.scm file in this path. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that etc channels.scm file into my config/Guix folder. I'm also going to copy the etc/config.scm into .config/Guix. Excuse me. But I'm going to rename that to system.scm because it's our system configuration. And now once we take a look at that folder, we'll have those two files in there. And now anytime we run Guix pull, that command will pull the channels that are listed in this channels.scm file. We also need to make an edit to this channels.scm file, because one thing I did in the installation image is to lock those channels to a specific commit, the same commit that was used to generate the installer, so that it doesn't require you to build the Linux kernel while you're doing the installation process. So we need to take those pinned commits out of that channel configuration so that we don't end up using them again. So I'm going to run Emacs. I think Emacs is installed, yep. And I'll go and open that file. So .config/geeks/channels.scm. And I'm going to go and take out these 2 lines that say commit. If I can get my key bindings working correctly. Actually, I'll just go to the end of the line and delete it. Oh, there it is. Okay, so both lines that say commit, I'm just going to delete both of those really quickly. And then I'm going to save this configuration and then exit Emacs. I've copied the final configuration and how it looks to the show notes in case you need to refer to that. But just take out those 2 lines that have commit and then the commit string, and make sure to include the parentheses that are around those lines. Save that file, and then you can run the pull command, Guix pull command, to get the latest commits of Guix to update your system. So that's what we'll do now. We're going to run Guix pull. And Guix pull may take some time depending on how recently the installation image that you used was generated. Guix always has new commits going into its repository. So does the Nonguix repo. So there may be a number of commits that will be pulled down and new packages that you'll find while you go through this process. Definitely check out the earlier videos I have in the Craft Your System with GNU Guix series that tell you more about Guix pull, and also like the everyday package management video for more information on how to use Guix, the Guix package manager. So this may take some time to pull this information down. So while that's going on, I'm going to tell you some more things. So we went through all this instructions so far about booting the system and changing the passwords. Also, we mentioned saving the configuration, and this is the updated config that we mentioned before. So we're currently running the system update process. The way that you do this is first you run Guix pull, as we did. That will get your local channel listing and derivation built from that, so that you can use that for building new packages and also installing new updates to packages. And then there is this Guix system reconfigure command, and that has to be run as the super user using this sudo command. We'll see that in just a minute, but the point is that you have to run it as an administrator so that it can apply those configuration changes to your system after you run Guix pull. Let's see how the progress is going on with that there. So yeah, it's going to take a while to get to this point. So in the meantime, let me just tell you a couple more things that you'll want to know about using Guix. So first of all, that system.scm file that was generated through the installation, that is your system configuration file. Like I mentioned, we'll talk about that in more detail in another video. But what I want to tell you right now is it is not a good place to set packages for installation for your user account. So the things that you want to install as a user, like let's say Emacs or any other programs that you need for day-to-day use for programming, or maybe Emacs packages that you use, etc. Don't put those in the packages list of your system.scm file. You should use that only for installing and updating your actual total system. For anything you want to install as a user, it's better to use the Guix install command, which I talked about in detail on the Everyday Package Management with GNU Guix video that I've got linked here. The reason why is because you don't need to update your system every time. You don't want to update your system every time that you install a new package. So basically what that's doing is like reinstalling your whole system effectively. It does it in a very efficient way, so it's not super bad to do that, but it's less efficient than just using Guix install. Usually you only want to update the full system whenever you want a kernel update, or maybe you want some of the system level services to be updated, or maybe you've added a new system service that you want to include with your system configuration. Then you would use that Guix system reconfigure command. But definitely that's something that you would do less frequently. You're probably going to install packages or upgrade packages in your user account more frequently than you would with your system configuration. So just something to keep in mind there. Also, I just want to say that becoming acclimated with the Guix system takes some time because it's kind of different than other Linux distributions that you may have used before. So definitely be patient. Use the resources available to you to learn how to do things. Also, definitely come chat with us in the System Crafters chat on IRC or on Discord if you have more questions. And definitely just try to have fun with your new system. It's a new way to do things, and it's very powerful, and it will take some time to learn effectively, but when you do learn it, you're going to enjoy it a lot, I think. So let's see if Guix pull finally finished. It's doing some more stuff here, so we may make a cut right now and jump ahead to the point where pull has finished, that I can then show you how to run the update command for updating your system that has already been installed. So we're going to make a cut right here, and I'll be back whenever this is finished. So the Guix pull command has now completed successfully, and now we can run the system update after we have completed the operation. So let's use sudo -e. I'll explain what this does in just a second. Guix system reconfigure, and then we are going to pass it the path to our config/geeks/system.scm file. So what this command does, it tells Guix to reconfigure your system installation using this system.scm file. And like I mentioned before, you have to run it as the super user with the sudo command. However, if you do this without the -e parameter, it's going to look for the channel file in the root user's home folder instead of your own home folder. So what we're doing is using the -E parameter to say, use the environment of the current user instead, which will enable it to pick up that channel file from our own user level Guix configuration. So that's a very important thing, so that it uses the same channel setup that you already have without having to pull the channels again or missing that non-Guix channel. So I'm going to press enter at the end of this line to start that process. It's going to ask me to authenticate with my user password so that I can do that administrator level action. And then after I do that, it's going to start running the update process. So we'll see that start in just a second here. So depending on how recently you installed your system, this could take a while because you may have a lot of packages that need to be installed. Another thing to note is that if there's been a new version of the Linux kernel that has been updated in the non-Guix channel, it will have to recompile that kernel from scratch, and that can take a very long time. It could take up to 45 minutes to an hour, depending on the speed of your system. So just keep that in mind. If you run the system update functionality after a kernel update, it can take a very long time to complete, but that's okay because you won't be doing this very often, and it shouldn't be a big problem for you. So I'm not going to wait for this to complete this time. I'll just tell you what happens. Once it's complete, it's going to give you a prompt to say that you can either restart all of your services by using a command from the herd system or service manager program, or you can just reboot the system. Typically, if you had a kernel upgrade, it's better to just do a full reboot so that you get that new kernel loaded. Otherwise, you can just keep using your system as normal, and you can use herd to restart those services if you want to. So at this point, we know how to install the Guix system and also how to update it for day-to-day use. Like I mentioned before, definitely check out that I'm getting prompted for my SSH key here. Check out that video about everyday package management with GNU Guix to learn how to install packages for your own personal use, because it's going to be very important to figure out how to use the system and get the programs that you need for your day-to-day use cases. All right. What's next? So let me see if I didn't miss anything before. Oh, no, that's it. Okay, so I'm planning to make more videos on how to use Guix as your daily driver Linux distribution. So here are some of the topics we're going to cover, and we'll cover a lot more things as well, especially based on the questions that you have that you ask as a result of this video and the others. First of all, how can we improve this system configuration to add other things we might need and to remove unneeded packages? So maybe you're like, well, I don't really want to use the GNOME desktop environment. I feel like it adds a lot of bloat to my system. How can I get all that out of there? I'll do future videos that will show you how to just have only the things that you need for your own custom configuration in your Guix system config. Also, sharing a base system configuration between multiple machines. That's something that I do, where I'll have a base configuration that says how I want my machines to be configured, but then I'll have separate config files that share that same base config so that I can install it on multiple machines and have the same configuration basically replicated across all of them. It's a very powerful technique, and we'll have a separate video to show how to do that. We'll also talk about how to manage user-level packages and profiles, not like the video that we talked about before, but in a different way that's a lot more powerful, which will allow you to check in your package lists, your manifests into source control, and have separate manifests for different types of packages that you want to install. It's a very powerful technique. So in the meantime, you can learn more helpful things by looking at the GNU Guix manual. There's a lot of sections there to tell you how to set up different types of services and configure things that you might want to do. You can also talk to us in the System Crafters Discord or IRC chat. There's a link to that here and probably in the description of the video as well, where you can ask questions and share tips with other people there. And I also recommend checking out the Geeks section of the System Crafters Wiki. There's links here in the show notes. The Catster, Daniel Rose, has done a really good job putting together a wiki for the Geeks part of the configuration that we talk about, I suppose. So if you want to learn some more about Geeks, go there. And if you learn anything new about Geeks that you want to share with other people, please feel free to contribute to the wiki by making a pull request to the repository, and then other people can see that information on the website to learn more about it. All right, so before I go, I would love to say thank you to my sponsors. These people have decided to sponsor the work that I'm doing, making videos about GNU Guix, GNU Emacs, etc., and I'm very thankful to them for their support. If you are interested in helping to support this channel, definitely check out the links below in the description. I'm on both GitHub sponsors and on Patreon. There's also a link to PayPal and GitHub sponsors for one-time tips. And if you don't want to sponsor financially, you can definitely help out by clicking like on this video and also sharing it with other people that you know who might be interested in these topics. So thank you very much for watching this video. Hopefully it helps you install Guix successfully. Let me know in the comments if it did, or just ask any questions if you have trouble, and I'll be happy to try to answer those. And until next time, thanks so much for watching, and happy hacking. We'll see you.